Being a Berserk fan is one of the hardest things in the world. Not only did we have to suffer the terrible loss of Sensei Miura and the relative fear of never seeing Guts, Casca and company again, but we also rejoiced at the news that Koji Mori and Studio Gaga would take the creative reins of the series to bring Miura's vision to its conclusion, only to discover that the releases would be as slow and irregular as before. Lucky for us, going back to what is arguably the darkest fantasy world ever conceived, though, never fails to provide excitement and curiosity for what's yet to come, and episode 378 was packed with events that hint at great developments for the story and the characters. So I'm gonna share with you my theories for the Eastern Exile chapter. First of all, let me address an element of confusion. I see many Berserk fans refer to the current stretch of the story as a new arc, but that's incorrect. The Berserk manga is structured with episodes, chapters, and arcs. So far, we have had 5 arcs: the Black Swordsman arc, the Golden Age arc, the Conviction arc, the Millennium Falcon arc, and the Fantasia arc. And this last one is not over yet, because Eastern Exile is a chapter within it. We don't know yet if the manga will ever have a 6th arc, even though I strongly suspect so. In fact, I believe this chapter might conclude the Fantasia arc with some very important developments. Kentaro Miura was an extremely well-read and knowledgeable artist, as testified by the incredibly complex way he managed to weave together aspects of Western and Eastern history, mythology, religions, and philosophies in his multi-decade spanning masterpiece. It would be naive to think that he was not familiar also with The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell, with a typical 3-act structure that the majority of Western cinema is based on. The thing is, said structure is composed of 3 parts, but each part is punctuated by different plot points. If we look at this simplified visual representation of the 3-act structure, we can guess what segment each arc of the manga corresponds to, and what events correspond to the various points. The breakdown I'm about to show you is my perspective and therefore subjective, and if you disagree with it, I would love to hear your opinions in the comments. Anyway, I tend to consider the inciting incident, midpoint and climax as external events, and the other plot points as internal events. Through this lens, it's easy to see that the eclipse was the inciting incident. Griffith's reincarnation was the rising action point, and Ganishka's defeat and merging of the different planes of existence is the midpoint. According to this breakdown, the Black Swordsman arc was meant to be the initial exposition, but instead of telling us, Kentaro Miura showed us a part of God's life as the Black Swordsman. Golden Age arc corresponds to the first segment between the initial exposition and the inciting incident, the eclipse. The Conviction arc is the segment between plot point 1 and the rising action point. The Millennium Falcon arc is the segment between the rising action point and the midpoint, and the Fantasia arc is represented by the segment between the midpoint and plot point 2. And like I said earlier, it's going to end with the Eastern Exile chapter. I suppose most of you have already figured out at this point that the plot points are 2 pivotal moments in the hero's inner journey, and therefore in Guts' mind and spirit. The first one is the moment Guts decides to become the Black Swordsman and take revenge on Griffith, the God Hand, and all demonkind. The second moment is the current state of desperation, when everything seems lost. Even though this particular chart doesn't highlight it in the hero's journey and in the 3-act structure that Hollywood relies on religiously, there is a specific moment called Crisis, which takes place before what is here called the pre-climax. It's worth mentioning that Berserk is an enormous piece of storytelling with a huge roster of well-developed secondary and tertiary characters, and it's nigh impossible to predict all the events that will take place, but I think it's feasible to understand what the main events will be. Since the very beginning of the manga, we have had that huge Chekhov's gun in the form of a small object capable to open a portal to the lower regions of the astral world, and no good Berserk fan could expect this object to not come into play before the end, but many in the past have theorized that he will have a meaningful role in the upcoming battle with Griffith, and I must respectfully disagree. I think the Behelit in God's possession is about to come into play in the next few episodes. The reason why I say this is that second plot point, aka God's darkest moment, was triggered by the realization that he could not harm Griffith, and our favorite giant sword swinger has never ever been this lost, not even after the eclipse, when all his comrades were torn to shreds by nightmare-inducing demons. He lost an eye and an arm, and the only woman he ever loved was in front of him by the man he once considered to be his best friend. What needs to happen now is for Guts to snap out of his psychological, emotional and spiritual predicament and find a new motivation to stop Griffith. It could be argued that the two most powerful symbols in this fantasy manga are Guts' sword and the Behelit. The Behelit, or Behelits plural, represent ego. Every apostle and every godhand has used one in their moment of greatest desperation and defeat in order to satisfy their most selfish desires, and therefore gods will either use or be tempted to use his Behelit at this exact narrative juncture, because this is the moment of his greatest fragility and susceptibility. For Guts to have an epiphany and evolve into the hero he needs to be, two things need to happen. He must discover a way to kill Griffith, which is a psychological factor, and he must find a new purpose in life, which is a spiritual factor. And here lies the significance of the other symbol, Guts' sword, as eloquently put by the Black Swordsman himself when succumbing to despair in the lower deck of the Seahorse. His sword was the only thing he ever believed in, his only dream and instrument of self-actualization, and from a symbolical standpoint, the sword represents his indomitable will. The problem is, he used his sword always for himself, and after the eclipse, to satisfy his selfish desire for vengeance. Anyone would have done the same in his shoes, and this doesn't make Guts any less compelling as a character, but it's undeniable that, except for Casca, he's a self-centered individual. I think the reason why Rickard could slap Griffith and Guts could barely slice a hair on his head is that they have different motivations. It's been often suggested and implied in the manga and championed by online fans that Rickard was able to touch him because he is outside of Griffith's narrative or story, and that's true. But it's also a poetic way, in my opinion, to say that Rickard is a truly altruistic individual, unlike the overwhelming majority of characters, whether human or not, we come to know in this story. There is a handful of individuals who have shown true compassion and selflessness along him. Flora, Shirke, and Luca, I would argue. And, of course, most elves and enchanted beings on Skellig Island, but they are gone now. Guts will be able to defeat Griffith once he decides. And that is the moment of self-realization in the hero's journey and in the three-act narrative structure, that his motivation to stop Griffith must not be selfish, but altruistic. A beautiful and, in my opinion, incredibly satisfying symmetry for the story would be as follows. In the eclipse, Guts couldn't save anyone because he was thinking primarily about himself. As a matter of fact, he saved himself thanks to his battle frenzy up until the moment he was stopped, and then Skull Knight saved both him and Casca. In the reincarnation ceremony, Guts managed to save Casca and a few others because his main concern in that moment was Casca and not himself. It would be great and beautifully symmetrical if in the end, which we all know will entail some kind of eclipse or ritual, more thoughts on that in another video, Guts were to save millions because of a new selfless motivation. So you might be wondering what's gonna happen precisely in the next few episodes. The other element that has been present in all the most important steps of the manga is the God Hand. These demons, particularly through the voice of their leader Void, have kept yapping about causality since the very beginning, and there have been many attempts to provide a philosophical framework for what causality is in the Berserk fictional world. My personal interpretation, which stems from the ideas explained so far, is that causality represents ego. Call it what you like, selfishness, egotism, self-absorption, but the main force moving humanity and demonkind in this world is ego. Every apostle chose to become one because of ego. Every Godhead member became an archdemon because of ego. And even though it's not anymore canon, the idea of evil explains it in very uncertain terms when Griffith descends into the deepest depth. It says it was created by the desire humans feel to find a reason for their suffering. I cannot pretend to be an expert of Buddhism and its many currents, but I know enough about it to understand that a core principle of this philosophical/spiritual/religious system is acceptance. Only through acceptance can we become enlightened. It is a very long path for most individuals, but acceptance is the path itself, nonetheless. Which brings me to the key point. The idea of evil was born because humans could not accept suffering. The Godhead members and the apostles are born because they do not accept death. And that's what desperation is, right? The suffering and madness deriving from a reality we cannot accept. Which is why Guts is about to face the most difficult test of his long journey. And the provider of this test will be the Godhead member that has received the most page time up until now. Slan is the most fascinating character of the Godhead, and not because she is a naked lust demoness, but because her backstory is perhaps the one I have the most fun trying to piece together. I will leave my thoughts on that for a Slan-centered video, but what I can say so far is that I strongly suspect romantic love was the most important aspect of her life. It is also very likely that if she is about to be slain by Guts, we will get to know her story in a few episodes. She is also the most fascinating, in my opinion, because I think she's going to play the main role in Guts pivoting from desperation to a newfound resolve. Slan has manifested her fascination with and lustfulness for Guts each time she has been shown, in chronological order, during the eclipse, during the slug count failed second ritual, and during the clip-off sequence. There was no conceivable way, given that, she is a demon with infinite resources and no kind of morality to stop her, that she would not attempt again to seduce Guts and turn him into either an apostle or even a Godhead member. And since the different planes have merged, there is no need for a ritual or eclipse anymore. All she needs to do is to manifest in the flesh and invite Guts to use his Behelit to become part of the demon kind. She has been patiently awaiting the best moment to convince him, and that moment is now, when our protagonist has lost almost any will to live. I wouldn't be surprised if she has even devised a way to turn Guts' regular Behelit into a crimson Behelit. Funny thing about causality is that it can be turned on its head. If ego is its main driving force, then ego can even twist and bend the rules of causality. Either way, she will try to convince Guts to sacrifice his new companions, and due to his confusional and weakened state, he will consider it, but ultimately reject it. But here's the catch. Guts has hit her with his sword before, after Skull Knight told him his sword, forged in the malice of countless evil beings, could do so, and Guts is outside of Slan's story, meaning his own egotistical desire for revenge does not revolve around Slan, but around the true king of selfishness, the silver-haired Falcon of Light. It makes perfect sense for Guts to be able to kill her, and it makes perfect sense for the many times foreshadowed mastery of the Berserk armor to come in the midst of this fight. Once it's done, someone with enough knowledge on the subject, my money is on either Daiba or Shirke, will disclose to him that the same thing can be done with Griffith. This event, and an emotional moment with Farnese, Serpico, Isitro and perhaps Shirke awakened from her astral trip, will cause Guts to find hope again. It will beget a new spiritual awakening for him about the need to swing his sword not just for himself and the woman he loves, but for his friends and humanity. And this will be the beginning of a new arc, which will deal with the war against Griffith and his apostle generals, which I can't wait for, and will constitute the segment between the second plot point and the pre-climax. Well, that's it for today, folks. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.